I've been professional seafarer for 20 years, okay, or you might not think it. And, I mean, I've always had concerns about the environment, but increasingly in the last well, I've been working for Greenpeace now for 5 years, but in the years preceding that, I was reading more and more about climate change and the consequences of man-made climate change. And I realised that it's down to, I think now, that, especially after Copenhagen, the chances of governments bringing about change is receding. I think it needs to come from a more grassroots perspective. So there was a moral argument. I mean, all the arguments are ticked. You know, there's a moral argument that previous generations didn't know about carbon dioxide causing man-made climate change. We don't have that excuse. So we have a moral imperative to do something about it, and I felt that I could use my skills, and the best way for me to do it would be to come and work on the Greenpeace ships. So that's why I'm here. You know, I'm mainly here for climate change. I think that it's going to affect, it's not just going to affect thousands of people who will lose their lives. It's not millions. I think it's going to be billions. I think it could, if it would run away climate change without any controls, it'll be a catastrophic event on the planet. Draw an equal parallel in the history of the Earth. You know, you talk about like the dinosaurs. I think the Earth will survive because it always will. You know, but I think that possibly it will be another major species extinction. You know, and I think humans will survive, but in a much more changed environment where we'll be living. I spoke to him in the Met Off. It sounds quite doom and gloom, I'm afraid, but you know, it's a very big event, man-made climate change, and it's going to affect a lot of people in a very negative way. And I think what it is basically we seem to be in this system of running this planet where we treat it as everything is infinite. There is not infinite resources of anything on this planet, apart from perhaps air and stuff like that. But you know, there's not infinite coal. There is not infinite. You know, there's not infinite sort of resources for us to take. And what right do we have to take them when future generations might need them down the line? We know that coal and gas is going to run out, so logically we should be preparing for stuff to replace it. You know, wind, solar. I mean, that to me is logic. But unfortunately, in the system of running the world that we live in, big corporations with a lot of money have a massive say in how the world is run. Say, take for example Shell. Shell is worth, I don't know how much, but a lot of money. But that money is purely based on what it owns. You know, how can one company own stuff that really belongs to all of us? But anyway, that's another issue. That on what is under the ground and what their future can extract out. You know, if you said that you cannot take anything else out of the ground, Shell would go bust overnight, probably. And a lot of people would lose a lot of money. And of course, a lot of that money is spent on lobbying, especially in the United States, which is the world superpower, which consumes a lot of the resources. So, and also, as China is developing, as Africa is developing, people are necessarily going to consume more and create more carbon dioxide. So it's going to be a runaway effect. And I fear for future generations on this planet, because I think they'll be living in a very changed world that possibly we would not recognise. You know, I think we will be looked at as like the lucky generation. We had all the technical advances, you know, iPhones, so on and so forth, without any of the drawbacks. Everything that we're taking out now is not really being costed. You look at the power generation company. If I owned a factory and I threw my waste out on the street and whatever, you know, my byproducts out on the street, I would be fined by the government and I would be asked to pay to have them taken away. Yeah. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct of power generation, some power generation, and it's a scientific argument that it is a pollutant and it's going to directly affect people's lives, has been made. No credible scientists now, or very few credible scientists, will stand up and say that climate change is not man-made and is not going to be dangerous. You know, if you look at the people who are, you know, because there's a lot of lobbyists paid for by the power industries to lobby against, that say there is no link, and they're using the same arguments that were used in the 60s by the cigarette lobby. They're using the same arguments. It's the same language. They're using the same language. So if power generation companies had to pay for the carbon dioxide that they produced, we would live in a very different world, because they would then have financial incentives to invest in alternative sources of energy. But they don't want to. And what right does Shell have to make a a decision to extract resources, which is going to affect us in a negative manner, based purely on financial considerations. How can one company make a decision that's going to affect all of us? That is a world that I do not understand. And we as people have to make a stand. Now, I'm willing perhaps to be arrested, and I have been arrested, and blah, blah, blah. Other people may not be, and I totally understand, may not be willing to make that. And we're not asking them to make that sacrifice. But what we are asking people to do is to make their voice heard. And if enough people shout loud enough, they will have to listen. And that is what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring the focus. And I understand that in the UK, people are, there's quite a hefty debate, but I understand in places like Africa, people are worried about whether they're going to get their next meal, in some places. So I understand that this can sound like a concern which doesn't affect them, but it does, and it's going to affect them, their children. It's not going to affect their children, it's going to affect them, and then their children, but it's going to affect their grandchildren. And lobbyists pay millions of dollars a year to get what they want. We as humans, people on this planet, because we all live together on this planet, have to make our voices heard, and we have to shout. And Greenpeace is one of the organisations shouting. And if we all shout together, then we're going to get heard. Yeah, hopefully.
And how do you explain or understand in your own mind the fact that governments aren't taking charge of this? Because surely it's their work, isn't it?
Well, I think one of the worst things that ever happened to this planet was the financial crisis. And look, this is what's so wrong. As soon as that financial crisis happened, governments acted, and they acted in a very speedy manner to resolve this financial crisis, which was down to money. And they bailed out the banks. But that sort of people were concentrating on the environment, and I think if that hadn't have happened, that there would have been a lot more input put on the environment. But certainly I come from the UK, and certainly now people are more worried about the economy than they are worried about the future, and the global warming and climate change. And I think that governments don't like to make unpopular decisions, yeah? And I think that there needs to be some unpopular decisions made, which aren't popular, But they needn't necessarily hurt now. But if we don't make them now, they're going to really hurt 10 years down the line. And what we need politicians who are prepared, who aren't in the pocket of government, aren't in the pocket of lobbyists, and who are prepared to make long-term decisions about the future. How can you... obviously democracy is a good thing, but every 5 years, that's how short-sightedly politicians plan, and you can't run a country based on a 5-year plan, I don't think. It needs to be certain things need to be much more long-term. And in the UK, yes, they are investing in renewable energy, but governments must take a lead. But I think that as people of this planet, we have to put pressure on the government, because if they don't, they have an enormous amount of pressure brought to bear on them by lobbying groups. Yeah. Enormous amounts. And so we have to counterbalance that by putting an enormous amount of pressure, and we need to tell them in no uncertain terms that if you don't introduce certain policies which will mitigate against climate change, then you will not be voted in and you will not go into government. And that's the only way. The governments have proven that they have not got the stomach to act. Yeah. Copenhagen, the Rio +20, we know now that they have not, and I don't think that we're going to get a globally binding agreement. I don't think that's possible. Yeah. I really don't. It's going to have to be regional. So Africa will have to try and come up with one. Europe is doing quite well and is coming up with one. America, if you think about it, George Bush, what would the world be like if Al Gore had got into the White House? I think it would be a very different world we'd be living in. Unfortunately, Bush got in and we had the Republicans. If you look at some of the Republicans, they don't even believe that climate change is happening. Yeah. So they're not listening to the scientists. They're listening to the lobbyists, the coal lobby. So we as humans, we have to take responsibility. We cannot just say, it's up to government. Now we have to take responsibility. We have to put pressure on them. And that's the important thing, I think. We have to look at, and it does work. Look at the Arab Spring. Look at all the people power. That brought about big change in their countries. Yeah. And we need, as humans, we have to take responsibility for our planet. And we have to bring about change.
So we have to communicate with the masses, really.
Yes, we have to. And it's the important thing, Writing letters to your MP, I know it's difficult, and there's some people who live in very difficult circumstances, but we have to take responsibility, because the governments won't do it without us putting pressure on them.
As you say, it's a particular challenge here in Africa.
Yeah, I totally understand that people this is probably well down on some people's list of priorities. But unfortunately, there's no getting away from the fact that this is a very important issue that needs to be addressed.